Yeah. I think Delta's the only one that brings something around, but then it's like, what is it, cookies? It's not a lot. It isn't like, so you're going Delta to LAX, and then
Overnight, the flight back to Melbourne goes, we usually get a 30 every night. Comes back on Melbourne 16. Your theory is on that flight. You get on, you get set, you have a walk, you have
yeah.
wake up and you're like,
Got a lot better. Yeah. Yeah.
except my noise cancelling headphones, I put on and discovered they didn't work when I was going in Europe. Clearly they cool.
Yeah. So you don't get sound rushing water. Maybe that could be nice. Kind of rocking you to sleep. The road one is being run by that year. It's like, so we got a grant. It's easy for the US. So probably it'll be visiting Roanoke, which is one of the case studies. And then organizing a workshop to show the US folks who are have a chance to be together.
The Russian city's going to be fabulous.
Yeah, yeah. So that's part of why the at least in the Russian presentation you saw some of the things about the small towns. Where I think there was sort of a merging of the two. Yeah. I think with the PIR network, that's not just in small cities. Like small cities. Small cities in Japan. But
Think about in Victoria, that you could, Lauren and I just wrote down at some small places in Victoria, using simple plan which dominates the town.
yeah.
But really, you explain the best way to explain it is not it's just one closure, but it's a series of closures that are interconnected.
Yeah.
And so I would look at it as a small town, as a set of circumstances which are knocking out a series of
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a network of industrialization because it's one node builds. It's never just independent. It's the horse.
A few of the time changes that are struggling a bit this morning.
Understand. I know, right?
Sorry,
Well, you're not sitting where you were supposed to.
So, I think it'll be easiest if the panelists just sit up here together.
I figured I was like.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. I have no expectations, so you're fine. Yeah.
Let's see.
What?
Some of the really important has to sit in the center.
Leonid can sit in the center. I'll take the end seat. So just should grab something for notes here. Don't steal my thing, okay? You're going to, aren't you? All right. I should get Leonid over here. Leonid, could you join us up here? Yeah. You get the center position. You're the guest of honor. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Post-Industrial Resilience Network. So I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of how today will work and what we're hoping the conversation will be like as we move forward. On this first panel, we're reviewing the state of the field, theory and evidence. I know that's sort of a very broad title. It might seem kind of vague, but generally what we're hoping to get out of it are thoughts on concrete questions that we can have going forward that will help motivate the short-term direction of the network, and then maybe some broader ideas for long-term projects as well. So even though it's called Theory and Evidence, it's not just a review of theory purely for theory's sake, but theory for how we can use it going forward. The second panel is about building capacity, and that's where we'll hear from Joe Schilling and Chris Morrill. And I really hope that one can help us think strategically about the network and about the resources that we can marshal, and especially about how the work we do can be used in a really valuable way for framing policy going forward and having an actual influence on things that happen in the world. So taking what the network does and making it not just about theory, but about application to real communities and real places. So in this first panel, I think Sebastian here has slides, so this provides a nice backdrop. I'm just going to offer some of my own thoughts on where I think the Post-Industrial Resilience Network could go. And especially here, I want to think about like what is this network and what it brings together, these three spheres that I talked about yesterday of post-industrialism, resilience, and institutionalism with rules, norms, and cultures. How can we really take advantage of that? So I'm thinking about the questions that I want to focus on that I think could be valuable. One, I'm obviously biased a little bit by my own interests, which tend towards things like regional governance, local governments, the role of law, and the role of ideology. So there's some broad things that I tend to gravitate towards. But I think a lot of us share those in common, and so I'll try to frame them in a way that makes them accessible. More importantly, I wanted to think about where there's variation that we could find across countries that we might not be able to get if we were just to do research in our own countries, in our home locations. PIR is very much grounded in the value of doing comparative work. So what are the kinds of questions we could explore that can take advantage of that variation that exists? Someone had mentioned to me yesterday, well, why are we putting the theoretical framing on the second day instead of on the first day? For me, at least, it was very helpful to understand where all of you were coming from yesterday. And I think there were a lot of interesting anecdotes about the ways these places are constructed differently. I learned a lot about Australia and Russia and Germany that I never even thought to ask as questions of how they might be different. So I think theory and the way we approach it is very much grounded in our experience of particular places. And so all of us come from these backgrounds, and I think for the group collectively, seeing what those backgrounds were will help us understand better what the commentary is that we see here today and the way the questions end up going. So I'm going to break in these questions into the rules, norms, and cultures area and think about what in each of those spheres could we ask. And so like really a single direction within each of those. I was really struck yesterday by Sally Weller's discussion of the sort of absence of a role for a lot of local government in Australia, and the strategic redrawing of boundaries that's happening there to create a certain narrative. And it got me thinking a lot about the importance of boundaries and the meaning that's given to them. And so the first question that I think could be of value for PIR to explore is the geography of governance. And by that, I mean the way that authority is distributed and amplified and diminished in how we construct resilience. So in all of these questions, I think it's important to view resilience as not just an outcome that we pursue that maybe has a certain set of metrics attached to it. So we say, how does the governance in one place influence its ability to be resilient? I think it's also important to position resilience as something of an independent variable. In the process of trying to chase resilience, in the process of trying to pursue that as a vision or a goal, which seems to be so common nowadays, how does that cause the construction, for example, of governance and its reconstruction? So I think if you look at the literature on resilience more broadly, resilience tends to get prioritized as an outcome. How does variation in some dimensions lead to a place's ability to be more resilient or less resilient? And so there isn't really a critical engagement with this idea of resilience as a process. So in this geography of governance question, we can see implicated the formalization of scale and power. At what level, in which sectors, et cetera, does real decision-making authority rest? And is resilience used to reify some rules and to break others down? And how does that selection process happen? And I think there's interesting connections to be made here to the broader literature on, for example, public choice versus regionalism, and especially the meaning of the local. And there's sort of three possibilities for what might happen to a local government, for example, or something that functions as a quasi-government at the local scale. Maybe it's genuinely empowered. Maybe rules are put into place that allow it to gain something that it didn't have before in terms of its autonomy. Maybe something's put in place that allows it to be bolstered in its ability to initiate legislation or to have capacity to actually implement that legislation. Maybe it's sort of a falsely empowering, in the Hayekian sense, a way to make the local feel like it's got a place in actually making decisions when really it's just a way to advance neoliberalism. Or maybe we actually disempower the local, and we do this through things like consolidation or the redrawing of boundaries, or taking away some of their ability to do things, whether that's on the fiscal side or whether that's in another policy domain like land use or economic development. The second area for norms, I think it could be very valuable to explore how these local governments, or wherever the power is nested, whether that's at a very small scale or a slightly higher level, how they engage non-governmental organizations. I think Joe had brought up a really good point, and we saw it in a lot of the presentations yesterday, that there is some role for example, local or regional intermediary organizations or other non-governmental entities, and that they play some kind of role in a lot of these settings, that you can't really ignore how the private sector is engaged. And so on the norms side, thinking, one, about how local governments engage with NGOs, what kind of relationships are developed in the process of chasing resilience, and what kind of variation in those relationships leads a place to become more or less resilient, however that ends up getting defined. I think there's also some value to looking at the relationships among governments, so whether they are competitive or cooperative. And a couple of you had asked questions yesterday, and this especially came out in a few of the presentations about what does cooperation look like among governments as they try to deal with the problem of resource scarcity. And so, for me, this is drawing very much on political science and legal scholarship literature from maybe Peterson about city limits narratives, or about defensive localism, for example, and what role the local government plays and how it relates to other units that are at a similar level. So if that first question about authority is thinking more vertically about where it nests, the second question is about looking horizontally at how resources are used and marshaled, how communities are empowered and disempowered. How does that function in terms of the interorganizational routines that we see develop? And then the last piece, and this also came out in some of the questions yesterday, is about culture. And especially this idea of individualism and how that expresses in different places as opposed to communitarianism or egalitarianism, and what that means. And so this might express, for example, in how private property is constructed and the rules around that. It might express in how political decisions end up being made and what gets prioritized as a narrative or not. And this really goes back to even Adorno and the notion of identity thinking. How are identities constructed in this process of resilience, and how are people's impulses about what ideologies they've grown to prioritize or have been conditioned to prioritize? How does that play out? I don't think that's really been explored very fully. Of all the three spheres, rules, norms, and cultures, it seems that in the resilience literature, it's really the culture piece that's gone missing somewhat. And one of the values of having a comparative network is that we would expect to find variation in cultures across a lot of these settings, and that they're really large enough that we would expect to find some variation even within them, and that there might be some value in operationalizing that and seeing if we can study it as an empirical object. This idea of what's the role of individualism, I think it also ties into a comment that Vera made yesterday about socialism and capitalism and what it means to be in the state we are in currently with regard to those broader forces, and how that intersects with the construction of people's ideologies and their individual selves, and what ends up getting prioritized. And when we imagine what resilience looks like, and the way that process works, whether it's focused on household and individual self-empowerment, or whether we create a stronger role for the state, for example, I think culture is going to end up playing a very important role here. So with those three questions, one about sort of where does authority nest broadly, and the second one about how do relationships occur and get broken down in a horizontal sense among local units or quasi-local units and NGOs. And then this third one about individualism, really going down to the person level and digging below even the social networks that exist, and thinking about how ideology influences the way resilience functions, as well as on the outcome side, a place's ability to be resilient. Again, leaving the measurement of that somewhat open for now. So I'll turn it over now to, we can just go in the order that we have on the list here. So Nadir, if you could talk next, and then Sebastian and Leonid. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers. And there I'd really like this to be a conversation about what you all think are the most valuable directions that we could go, and sort of what are the bigger theoretical debates that this network could help contribute to.
Okay, good morning. I would like to use a case study to illustrate my points. And this is little research we've done on the Skolkovo Innovation Center, which has been built near Moscow. And I find it interesting because it illustrates the difficulties and tensions associated with the attempt to establish a new economic development path in a country where institutions and laws do not really matter or do not really work. So the paradox of the Skolkovo, which is a huge technopark, is that it seemed to be that all formal institutions are in place. There are laws, there is a development cooperation, there is state funding. So there is a hard infrastructure for innovation. But on the other hand, the actual norms that prevail in society are not really supporting things like rule of law, respect for intellectual property. So that makes such a project very problematic. And yeah, that's the most interesting part in my understanding, that the whole project has been bedeviled by scandals, investigation of corruption, investigation of public funds embezzlements, some arbitrary prosecution by various law enforcement agencies. At some point, somebody from Microsoft came on the premises to sign some multi-million-dollar contract, and at that very moment, some law enforcement agency arrived and locked everybody in and confiscated cell phones and passports. So the contract obviously was not signed. Yeah. Does Virginia Tech often have law enforcement raiding properties when some big investors come? Probably not. Yeah, so that case is, I think, is a good illustration that has a lot to do with the dichotomies between formal and informal institutions. And there is obviously there is a collateral damage, so to say, to projects implemented within an authoritarian country that are supposed to make that country more open, more modern, more Western. And I would say it is impossible, because even if you build everything, if you follow all the cookbooks of innovation, regional development, you hire best designers, and they can indeed design a nice campus. They can design buildings that would meet the technical requirements, all the specifications for various technological processes. But when at the political level, the country likes to invade its neighbor and then face sanctions that prevent technology transfer and prevent funding mechanisms, then I would say forget about it. Start from the fundamentals, from transparent political processes, from good governance, from rule of law, and then innovation will come, but not another way around. You cannot sort of replicate success of Silicon Valley by just building buildings that look like Silicon Valley. They will not be populated by the same processes that lead to innovation elsewhere, because it has to be a unique process that has key ingredients. It's not about space or design of buildings, it's about something else. Yeah, and I think it's thinking of the network. It's I think one of the ways to kind of integrate Russia into the activities of the network, to look at concepts such as modernization, transition, and look at the role of institutions, not necessarily only formal, because formal you'll find everything in order, but this is a different story from how people actually act and what informs their choices and behavior. It's not necessarily that they follow formal rules. Yeah, I think I'll stop now and.
I may continue. Yeah, I will continue, but a bit from the different angle. Would you please? Sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
One after now. Yes, for me it's interesting to reflect on factors of success. Yes, factors influencing the successful development, and we more or less know from theories and from empirical research these factors, which are maybe specialization in one or other industry, it's human capital, it's level of trust and type of social capital, and then as consequences of this, yeah, okay, maybe some cultural also, cultural determinants or invariants, and then as consequences of this, we have formal and informal institutions, which is also important factor, and business environment, investment, innovation, and so on and so forth. But maybe there are several models and several logical consequences how these factors may provide uprising development or declining. For example, just one of possible consequence of steps, yes, if you have somehow maybe big international company comes to some not very developed place for some reason, and they bring some new standards, they train people, they increase level of human capital, they demand a higher level of knowledge, and also because of this, community became more active in protecting their civil rights, voting for better politicians, I mean, who may suggest some intelligent policy, and they control better this political process. They require for better quality of environment, of services. And because of this, the image of this place may change and may attract even more smart people and investments. And you will see finally this uprising development. And also may happen something in the opposite direction. When local authorities, for example, preoccupied in creation of any jobs to struggle with unemployment, and they develop specializations which don't need to hire qualified people, and as a result of this, also some declining spiral may start to develop with lower levels of human capital, lower levels of political, policies and government, and the result of this more populist decisions, higher corruption, worse image of the city, and so on. But maybe there are also other types of models, and we do not know much about it. And what is also interesting that we should avoid some simplistic, very obvious decisions about policies by reading official documents. So it is not only one expression of policy. So they may have strategies or visions or plans, but if they correspond with the reality and with the real commitment to do something or to change something is a big question. So you should be very, very careful and should, of course, compare official documents and some informal and other maybe strategic documents with day-to-day policy, which may be different. Maybe some contradiction between long-term priorities and some decisions made. They may have in their policy declared that they want to develop IT technologies and knowledge economy and so on, but when they have big investors coming to develop logistical center, and they will provide for this person a big site for free, almost for free, just to attract some jobs and some investments. And it may be contradictory with main purposes and so on. So we should somehow to know how to evaluate real policy and the impact of this real policy on local development. I recently read a book written by Michael Storper and his co-authors, Rise and Fall of Urban Economies, and it's about Bay Area and big Los Angeles, so it's about big metropolitan areas, but the research question may be the same also for much smaller and less developed places. That the role of networks, of non-governmental organizations, of intermediates between business and science in innovation and so on. So the question was why San Francisco was much more successful than Los Angeles. And it is not because official policies were very different, but it is because the society is different, the structure of networks is different, and somehow also the structure of business, because sometimes very big corporations prevent from open exchange of ideas, and also business leaders, it depends what they have in their minds as a world view, and if they continue to practice and believe in old managerial practices, in vertical structures and so on, it's very difficult to change. So finally, for me, it was interesting, one of conclusions that it is not so much technologies and official political documents, but very much it depends on worldviews of elites. But the question is how to change it, who is authority for them, whom they could believe, and how to change these worldviews. Okay, yes, I may stop with this.
Thank you.
I've got a more fancy presentation. Yeah, just a few slides, and I'm sure I can frame all this the first talks on on future pathways for the network, and don't have a big background in resilience and also in post-industrial developments, but yeah, I grew up at the edge of the Ruhr Valley in Wuppertal, old industrial city, and so I've also, through my background as economic geographer, I know these processes, and I think I can frame a couple of thoughts we have heard before. So when Thomas sent me some questions I should thought about, I picked like 5 topics out of that. There was a question, future topics for the network. What are empirical gaps? What are suitable concepts and theories we could use? What are boundaries, and how can we translate the findings and our ideas to the policy world and also to practitioners? The first point, also from my background now in Melbourne, I think new perspectives on process thinking or the process of post-industrial transformations and resilience would be interesting. And I think it's really about contextual specificities, and we heard that it's about spaces and what makes them so special. Why is LA different to San Francisco? Why did they have different pathways of change? And I think that's what bring us together here. This focus on the interplay of institutions, economic development, and how these processes are embedded in political institutional settings in different places. And I think that's what actually all bring us together. Some question that came up the last weeks when I prepared the conference here is, how do we understand actually post-industrial process? What is it actually? What makes it so different to former concept of deindustrialization? So what is new here? How is resilience understood in this context? And then more specific questions, which already came up here. Why are some places able to cope with disruptive economic or institutional changes? And I think we heard a couple of examples yesterday with case studies. I think really current question that also is involved in my work at the moment. How do resilience politics influence post-industrial processes? So the interlinkage between this really distinctive resilience politics, which is quite new in the policymaking sphere, and how are these policies embedded in specific urban or regional contexts? And another question is, what are indigenous and exogenous influences on these processes in different places? I don't want to go into detail into understandings of resilience, but I think this understanding of resilience as a process, as an evolutionary process, was quite helpful for me when I started my readings in resilience, so this socio-ecological understanding. And what was quite interesting that there are also linkages between evolutionary economic geography and the literature of resilience, so that helped me a lot. And this understanding of open processes of change and transformation, and the understanding that it's a complex process and it's non-linear, so not this very static understanding of resilience. I think we can talk about that later maybe. The empirical gaps, I found when I thought about it, I think the linkages to the sustainability, low carbon, zero carbon transitions literature is quite obvious to combine these areas. And Nadir brought that up. The transitions area might be helpful. So from my work in Melbourne at the moment, we concentrate on experimentation. So we see these action fields which are implemented by the city council as small-scale experiments, and we want to trace them back. How did they work? How were the pathways of these experiments? What is the knowledge creation? What were innovative in this experiments? That might be a new helpful concept here. And what are the impact, actually, of this policy initiatives? This is also in this context of 100RC, C40, and these big city networks. That's a quite common question at the moment. What are actually the outcomes? And we brought that, it came up, the translation of outcomes from A to B, from one city to another, this kind of policy mobility. There's some literature coming up in that area, so that might be also an interesting area. Yeah, in terms of comparative empirical studies, which would be interesting between those 5 countries, actually, I would talk about that a bit later, and the struggles maybe, and also really focus on economic transitions. That's the topic which is coming up in the city council at the moment in Melbourne, because it's more on social topics at the moment, but also what's happening in the city context in economic transitions. So, for example, what we can see there, they're kind of re-industrial processes at simultaneously to a deindustrialization process, small-scale entrepreneurs who start like small, medium businesses and kind of manufacturing, which is really fascinating. And we can identify some clusters in the city center, and that might be also an interesting process to analyze. And then, yeah, as a geographer, the topic of scale. So what are we looking at? Is it national scale, supranational? Is it the region? Is it the city? Or the local level? So yesterday on a talk from Thomas, made some note. So there were like this geographical terms like the region, local, urban core, counties, states, metropolitan, suburbs, university hubs, smaller cities, towns, core city. And as a geographer, you say, wow, that's great, all the terms you need in your lecture for urban geography. But I think it's important to probably think about it and what are we actually looking at. And that it's very helpful, I guess, for further research probably. Yeah, so the concepts I'm more familiar with, but I really see in the context also from resilience, and yeah, it's more economic geography concepts like evolutionary understandings, past developments. There's a lot of literature on lock-ins in industrial areas, interplay of economic and institutional structures, so there's a lot of work there in that area. Another field of research is the transition studies, which looks at the socio-technical change over time, so how technologies and institutional changes are embedded and provide change. So there's this multi-level perspective, for example, which is quite popular at the moment, and the transition management perspectives. And also a bit older concepts, but still quite popular are the innovation studies, so regional innovation systems, and a bit more other experimentation concepts to analyze regions or also small-scale projects, also in this innovation context. Yeah, so the focus on institutions. So I mean, there is some work on institutions and deindustrialization. The work of Graper in the Ruhr Valley back to the 90s. I think that's probably also a good starting point. And looking on institutions, I don't want to go into detail here. So for comparative analysis, my thoughts were, yeah, so this evolutionary aspect is still fascinating me. So it's tracing back different processes from what happened actually, why it's a deindustrial area or region, and what makes it post-industrial. And I think the focus, and I got that yesterday, it's really about actors, stakeholders. It's not just policymakers, it's also philanthropic actors. It's about the industry, and I think we should probably be open more on that. Be open for stakeholder actor analysis, who are the key actors involved in these processes, but also what are the policies, the outcomes, and also other economic and institutional processes. So more specific, what are the key actors, stakeholders, and what's also quite interesting, and that's what I learned during my PhD, is also looking at resistant actors. So not like just looking at the success stories, also learning from not so successful stories, and looking who are actually the resistant actors, the resistant processes. So that might be helpful, or governing, also resilience in policy making. And really looking at local and regional specificity. So that's my geographical background probably. And what I said before, success stories, but also what are the barriers and the challenges? Why didn't it work? Then the scale thing, what I brought up. So what are we looking at? Is it the local level, the region, national or supranational level, or the interplay between those levels? But I think it's helpful to make that clear. And and it's fascinating. And Storper was mentioned that he said, cities are very unique, and there are different seabeds of social interactions in cities, and there are specific institutions and political actions and actors, and so it's very important to look at the specific context of spaces. And the last point I looked at or thought about it, the exchange or diffusion of knowledge to policymakers. So from my background, I could say I work together with the policymakers in the city council, and also to representatives from C40 and ICLEI. So there's a bit of continual exchange, and also so at the chair I work for, there's some relation to the EU and smart specialization in that area. So that's from my background. But I think it's important that we, as researchers, bring the knowledge to policymakers and also to practitioners, and should thought about new ways and solutions probably for that. Okay, thank you.
Jennifer Lawrence is a postdoctoral research associate with the Global Now.
Sorry.
Yeah. Do you need the mic?
Okay, so I'm not scheduled to speak, but I just want to make some comments about the panel and try to tie it in with some of the themes that we've talked about the last couple of days. So first of all, I was really happy to hear a lot of what was said on this panel. So I was making a couple of notes of some of the repetitive themes that were coming up. So what I'm hearing is human capital, social capital, institutions, both formal and formal, networks and the power of networks to think about these things together. So the idea of multiplicity, innovation, scale, transfer of knowledge. But those things don't happen without the stakeholders, the actors that you're mentioning. And I think that we have to address those things together and make the actors and the agents very explicit in this. So I think that that's very reflective of what's in this room, because in this room we have economic geographers, we have sociologists, we have critical geographers, human geographers, urban planners, environmental political theorists, We have people from urban planning. We have people from landscape architecture. So the room itself is very reflective of the need for the multiplicity that we're talking about. The other thing that I kind of am sensing is that this old debate about resilience and what it is rearing its head a bit here. So we're trying to understand what resilience is and how it acts. But I think that the power of resilience is in its multiplicity, and that we need to hang on to that as one way to potentially move forward. So I pulled up an article by Cecilia Asberg where she talks about resilience as cyborg, and I just want to read a snippet of that because I think that that really reflects this idea about the constantly evolving nature and why that evolutionary perspective is really important for us to hang on to. So she says, the notion of resilience has something in common with the word cyborg, a legacy of systems theory, cybernetics thinking, and other ambivalent sources. The concept of resilience has also taken on a wily and non-innocent life of its own, which I think is really important, that we can't think about this as a neutral subject. We need to infuse this with the human element. We need to infuse this with the politics. We need to infuse this with the structural issues that are creating the need for resilient subjects in the first place. Okay, she goes on. From ecology to Earth surveillance, it is steeped into various forms of the social sciences and humanities, covering everything from global finance and trauma, psychology, national security, public health, and urban planning. If resilience, most common definition, is the capacity of a system to bounce back from its original form, then we are in deep trouble. Resilience can reverberate with neoliberal conservatisms of all kinds, with social and environmental engineering, human exceptionalism, and also with the ontology of the ethics of sameness. So here, the comparative element that you're bringing out, I think, is very important. We're not looking for something that's similar, right? We're looking to understand what are the common reference, yes, but what draws, what can we understand from the strength of this comparative aspect? Resilience needs to be treated as trouble, as cyborg, as monster, with great care as we translate, code it, practice environmental literacy around it, and the more than humankind. We need to take it on and work with its excess of meaning, for example, with the links between resilience and cultural resistance. Critically and creatively, we need to deal with resilience in passionate conversations with previous and ongoing research that it may well extend beyond our disciplinary comfort. So again, going back to the idea that we all are from very different disciplines within the room. The promise of resilience as monster lies in its post-disciplinary life. Here we can move beyond the idea of the universal man as the pinnacle world order of civilization. The promise of resilience lies in its inherent resourcefulness. That is, if it is taken as an attentive conversation with theories of vulnerability, embodiment, and material difference, that's where the potential of it lies. She concludes, culture was always already part of nature, as was resilience. Identities, entities, and scholarly labels do not precede relations. In that process, ontological and relational vein, it is thinking with and also becoming with resilience, and that is really the question that we need to answer. What type of resilience is it that we want to become with as we're moving forward? And in this network, what kind of resilience is it that we want to become with as we continue our scholarship? Okay, so I'll end there, but just a couple of questions to move on from that. How can the comparative approach that we're talking about here and that's been presented very effectively by our panelists here encompass the normative dimensions of resilience? So again, how can we understand the structural issues that have created the need for resilient subjectivities as we are trying to address the comparative element? I think that those two have to be fused in order for it to be a powerful narrative. And also, this goes back to the question that was on the table yesterday. How can the legacy of exploitation and uneven geographies be addressed within this comparative element? So I don't know if the panelists want to respond to that, but I'll come around the room with a microphone, so we'll open it up to questions if there are no comments yet.
Yeah, I think those two questions you asked, I would open it up to the entire room as well, so you can kind of hear their thoughts. I'm sure they've heard plenty of ours.
Sure. So questions, concerns, comments?
Yeah, I want to pick up on Jennifer's comments, Jen, 2 ends.
about defining resilience. I think that we've heard so much about all of the universe, and I think this is of different things that affect resilience and different issues we need to think about and problems. But I think, as not a member of this project, but as someone who's really interested in what you're doing, I'd urge you to spend a lot of time at this first principles stage, figuring out what the boundaries of your playing field are, so that you're all working towards a common goal. And so I think that one of the ways that you could do that, and I know that you've left it open at this point in order to sort of be fertile and be open to sort of different perspectives, and I think that's amazing. But before going too deep into your own research, I think that you need to anchor it somehow. And that doesn't mean defining resilience as one thing. I think what it means is conceptualizing this broadly as something with various facets. And you brought up a bunch. I have a list here too. Yesterday, I brought up this idea of like description versus ambition. So like, is this a feature of a place or is it an ambition? I think there's a difference between those things. There's resilience in theory, so you brought up this whole sort of theoretical dimension as well as the sort of normative side of it. What is it that it should be? What is it that we're aiming for? Resilience in policy is something that we've seen as well. Peter's presentation yesterday sort of showed how that's playing out in actual policy, or at least trying or practice. And then this idea of scale, again, I think we can return to, and I think that there isn't a right scale to look at this. I think there's lots of opportunity to look at resilience at different scales, but it also offers an opportunity to have a critical analysis of whether resilience is a different thing at different scales. And again, coming back to this idea of sort of what scale is prevailing, what's being imposed, what's being empowered, et cetera. And so there can be multiple definitions throughout this, and I think that the sweet spot is going to be for this project trying to find something where you can engage with all of these different facets, such that your research can add to all sorts of veins of scholarship, but also not veer way too far away from each other, as is potentially the tendency in such very different institutional environments and traditions. So, I think that it'll be really interesting to see what you guys come up with.
I think they're related. I've done some work here in the U.S. looking at what I called like policy mimicry, or the diffusion of policy ideas, particularly on this idea of resilience and how places are quick to use the term without defining or really questioning whether it's useful to the kinds of things they're trying to achieve. So I think there's evidence of that situation here. I'm guessing there's also evidence of that worldwide, especially related to these larger universal philanthropic ideas related to 100 resilient cities and others. So I'm curious in this idea of how this policy is diffused, or how resilience thinking is diffused, and how we use the term differently from place to place. I often think of it as being a very sloppily used term, something that economic geographers and planners have called fuzzy terms throughout the years, and I really think of resilience as increasingly fuzzy, and all the problems associated with that I think are more and more critical than we can even imagine, given how much money is now being put behind these ideas of resilience, and how much stake we're putting into resilience planning, and just think there's a lot to think about, and I'd love to think about ways that we as an international community could engage in that debate and think more critically about how we're using the term and the implications of that usage, especially in light of the fact that we don't think too much about how it's used. I think it's a very dangerous and potentially I don't know, a disruptive thing that we are all doing, and we're all playing into it in a sense too. So I think, you know, we have a role in this. I also think that in the U.S., I've spent some time looking at kind of the role of consultants, sometimes think tanks, sometimes philanthropies play in that process. And I'd love to see how that plays out internationally. We have a practice here of sort of paying a handful of consultant groups or think tanks. Most of the money for these plans is often kind of thrown at one or two different groups, and I won't name them because they are allies too at the same time. But I think that's really important. At least here, that's what's happening. Is we ask someone to come in and help us write a plan without thinking through the extent to which they're actually providing us with a unique plan that's specified and catered to the local needs of whatever, you know, community we are that's calling them in. So I'd like to think about the larger kind of diffusion of policy and the role of philanthropies and think tanks and consultants in that somewhat sloppy mess that's happening. I don't know if others are as well, but I think it relates to some of the comments you guys brought up, and I'd like to think about ways to move that work forward in the future. I'll just walk it over, Joe.
Yeah, I'll wait and see what.
We'll talk about the sloppiness a little later. But just so your comment prompted this thought, which is in terms of the power of these actors, right? So what if the Rockefeller Foundation had not created 100RC? So the fact that they did, and in some ways sort of, you know, changed the field, both in terms of practice and, I mean, one could even argue in theory. So, I mean, I think that it sort of illustrates your point.
Yeah, and I'll just give a couple quick comments that maybe we'll try to tie some of this together. Yeah, maybe. So I think that issue of where power and authority nests, like where decision making actually ends up getting placed. I mean, maybe it's that we look at what happens in the cities that are in 100RC versus the ones that are not, or the cities that have had a really strong role for consultancy and that have kind of prioritized those actors at maybe the expense of communities and actually existing social networks that have a lot of knowledge and valuable capital embedded in them. I think Sally's story about the brush fires yesterday particularly resonates with this notion of what that gap is between where we put formal authority and then the norms with which that's exercised. And I guess this came up with what Leonid and Nadir were talking about as well, that gap probably looks a lot different in different places as to where there's, you know, things expressed formally or in institutional rules, and where it's a regulative action in terms of where we put resiliency and who that empowers, and then there's the piece of where that actually ends up translating to. And I think there's some value to looking at to what extent have we fully institutionalized and formalized this in different locations. And what does that end up meaning? And maybe this also ties to what Jen said about ensuring that the comparative piece is also allowing us to reflect on sort of the normative, or if you even want to go as far as saying like the ethical or moral consequences of resilient processes and how they get defined in different places. Does it matter the extent to which they're formalized in different ways, or does it matter whether we put authority within a network or within practice among different groups, or whether we actually take groups that have traditionally been outside roles of authority and we actually give them some kind of real strength. So I think within this network we'll find a lot of variation there, and we'll find differences in the gap in terms of how institutionalized resilience becomes, and through which actors it becomes most strongly institutionalized, and that maybe there's there's some advantage to be looked at there, that maybe we can treat that gap itself as an empirical object somehow.
Yeah, and I think also the focus on the post-industrial context begs that question that you're raising, Tom, about the integration of why these places were already, why are they needing to be resilient, and how were they always sacrificed as part of that.
And it's really nice to hear some of these words that I think about a lot popping up in the conversation. And I think one of the key ones, nesting, embedding, and context, are increasingly important to being able to understand how the resilience concept's actually being used in practice. I'm becoming increasingly cynical of the difference between strategy and implementation. And resilience is a very, very powerful strategic term for policy making, but the practices through which it's implemented are very much nested in the existing path dependencies of the organizations that are tasked with trying to realize that. And if those organizations continue to work in the same ways that they have, there won't be any institutional change to the practices that are embedded in a wider democratic form of governance. And that's something that I think the values dimension gives us an opportunity to look at a lot more, particularly in terms of when we think about values. Are we talking about allegiance to the existing democratic system, or are we talking about assertive and activist forms of governing? And increasingly the need to encourage those governance organizations to become activists on the behalf of citizens rather than on behalf of capital. And resilience opens up opportunities for that to happen, but as we've seen some of the discussions around the economic orientation of those systems, when this is solely oriented towards growth, and particularly in terms of GDP, then that doesn't actually change anything for the people on the ground. It still remains, the citizen remains a passive recipient of services, not an activist in the practice of governance itself. And when we look at that post-industrial context, there is still a temptation to make this about economic systems. And it's actually much more important for me to make that about citizenship, engagement, and empowerment if it is to be able to realize any kind of emancipatory potential in the wider changes of democratic organization and democratic systems of governing. That's a key issue for being able to rebuild the trust which has broken down between citizen and state. That is an essential component of resilience building in practice. I think one of the opportunities we have is to be able to do cross-comparative analysis of how this strategy is embedded in the value systems that are increasingly nationally oriented towards concepts of Russian identity, Australian identity, American identity within particular social systems, for understanding what governing is meant to be and who it is for. And resilience gives us opportunities, but we have to understand it as having both positive and negative repercussions depending on the way that it's implemented. And we can start drilling into that through some of these specific space-based paradigms to look at how that's manifest in the real world.
Yeah, Peter, I really appreciate your comments on that. And I think I saw Sally have her hand up briefly too. So I think the critical thing for the network going forward and what might help distinguish it from other efforts like this that maybe focus on some of the same geographies. One would be thinking about when we say resilient and what it means, that we don't just prioritize the economic narrative, or that the metrics we use are not just about that. I think there's a real risk with making resilience just about efficiency or self-help or economic vitality or increasing capacity or however you're going to measure it, where we've seen it get measured in that way repeatedly. I think there's also need to go beyond just sort of these static forms of resilience that we still see get used, especially in emergency preparedness or in climate response. And then the second piece is, and this is what I was trying to emphasize at the beginning, is putting resilience as a process that influences change. So we don't just think of it as a uniformly desirable outcome. That if we do think of it that way, I mean, it's very reductionist, and I think it takes away a lot of the value of having a comparative network like this. That if you imagine it as a process that is happening in a lot of different locations, who are the actors involved in it? What are their values? How do they work with each other across the boundaries that have been imposed on them? I think ensuring that resilience as a process gets treated as a motivating force, as an explanatory variable, and that it gets viewed in a more nuanced way as an outcome that's more grounded in humanity, that maybe has more humane reflections in it, that could be the thing that really allows this comparative perspective to be taken advantage of, and that makes this network different than a lot of the other ones that we might be seeing.
So we have a bit of a line forming. So Vera, Jim, Sally, and I also want to invite the other panelists to respond. And if I haven't seen your hand and it's up, please let me know. Obviously, you've given us a lot of food for thought, so thank you for that. Vera.
Thank you so much. This is a great conversation. But what you just noticed, Tom, and then you reflected on it, but I think this hasn't been raised during this two-day conversation because we keep talking about experimentation, innovation, urban renewal, consulting, philanthropy, think tanks, economic growth markets, innovation, integration. But yet, all these are obvious aspects of economic resilience. Yes, we know people have been talking about this. But what is missing here is this major critique on resilience that comes from geography and from the same people that you all cited. As Jamie Peck has been talking about this, an economic geographer. Bob Jessup, a state theorist, has been talking about this. Julian Reed, who is not here, but who is our friend as well, has been talking about this, is that all these aspects of economic resilience actually reinforce the problems that we are trying to solve. So it's essentially the reproduction of the neoliberal ideological project. So what we can do is we can reflect on the structural inequalities that create these problems and put them in place and reinforce uneven urban development through experimentation, innovation, think tanks, consulting, economic growth markets, and etc., which has been, I think, missing from this conversation. But yet we still say, yes, of course, we will do this. So maybe it's an important piece of scholarship that is missing at the table. And these people who have been cited are also talking about this aspect, the back side of the resilience. And I think we have to come back to it and critically reflect on it.
Just to pick up a little bit on what Vera said and others. And this is the cynical part of me coming out now. I've been, how many workshops have we done over the past 6 years, Peter, we've been at? I'm hearing the same conversations at every one of them and not moving forward much in terms of everybody recognizes the problems associated with using the concept of resilience as a kind of trope to get something done that sounds good, but it's really used in a kind of neoliberal sense. And the literature on this is pretty rich. I would argue that if you try to go back and just kind of reinvent that literature, we're spinning our wheels because it's out there, and a lot of the points that have been raised here have been discussed, I would say, ad nauseum over the past 5 or 6 years. I think there are a couple of things that have emerged from that literature and those discussions that are important and have been raised here that it's worth settling on. Number one is, a lot of people who've been in this now talk about really the only proper scale that they would argue, the best scale they would argue for dealing with issues related to resilience is at the community level. It's not at the state level. It's not at the national level. It is at the local community level. And even sub-state, suburban level, it's at the communities. And you have to empower them and give them opportunities, and don't even talk in terms of building resilience. Empower them to make decisions about their future. Resilience is about the future. What's your vision of the future, and how do you expect to deal with that? So, I wouldn't want the network to spend a lot of time going back over the literature, and I share Maggie's frustration. Maggie was at one of these, 4 years ago and so on, and we've Same thing applies. I would add that the one point of that comes out and that we've had on these is the practitioners, such as Chris and others, and we've had them, fire chiefs, etc. They have particular problems they want solved, and they, want to know how best to solve them over the long term. So one of the ways of kind of moving forward is, I think we have to be somewhat pragmatic about what it is we're trying to do. The question now that I have after venting on that is going back to Tom's point. I think we do need to think about culture, but I think culture is about as fuzzy as resilience in terms of what it really means. There are alternative definitions of culture. There are alternative ways of dealing with it. We stress the notion of individualism here in the United States, but in reality, if you read people like Seymour Lipset and others, there are multiple values within American culture, and individualism is just one of them. And so to focus on one aspect of culture and not look at the multiplicity of dimensions of a culture is dangerous, I think. So we need to think about what are the worldviews, what are the kind of dimensions of culture that influence these kind of resilience, and begin to structure our thinking around that rather than arguing, that it's this or this. It's culture writ large, and defining whatever that means and whatever the dimensions of it are across cultures, I think is important. One that's come up here is the value of property, and how does that vary from place to place, and whether it's an intellectual property, whether it's an actual owning of land, etc. There are lots of different aspects of culture that could come to play out. Thank you. That wasn't a question.
Thanks, Jim. I think you also point to the question that Sebastian raised earlier about the space for resistance. So if we are, in this resilience machine, as it were, then how can we sort of create fissures and cracks in that in a productive way that sort of invites, sort of what Jim and I have been working on, a transformation rather than adaptation or mitigation. How do we interrupt this in a productive way?
So I think my comments really fit with what Jim just said. Talking off stage yesterday, a lot of the conversations were about what people feel, the world of affect, which we didn't talk about formally for 1 minute. We talked about empowerment, not what empowerment is. We've mentioned hope a couple of times, but haven't really discussed how people get hope if they haven't got it. We haven't discussed flourishing or any other synonyms for the word flourishing. We haven't discussed how we might move from the idea of a place being resilient to the people in the place flourishing, and what you need in places like the Latrobe Valley where people have lost hope, how to return hope to people, and what possibly you could do to intervene. Now, when I say that, I think that one of the pat solutions of neoliberal resilience is to do some visioning. We need a future. We have to think about the future. Naomi Klein, Eric Schwindo, whole lot of people have been saying, no. You get people who've lost hope and demand they think about the future, and all you do is disempower them even more. And there's quite a lot written on that book, Cruel Optimism, if anyone's read it. The disempowerment of asking disempowered people to get themselves empowered is really crushing. So I think we've got a really big question. I don't actually know the answer to this, but I don't think that the technologies that are being applied, whether within the resilience frame or any other, is addressing adequately the question of returning hope. And lots of people have said here, the big corporation's not going to come, God's not going to fly down in the helicopter and land us the good life again. So where are we going to get hope from now?
That's a great question. And I'm glad that you're bringing it back to the affective dimension and hope. So we're almost, well, we're past time a bit, but I do want to invite the panel to comment, and we can close this out, and after that, continue our conversations.
Yeah.
Just I would like to underline two things which are interesting for me, and I think they are important. When you mentioned human capital, social capital, and institutions, okay, yes, they are explaining factors for success. But for me, because I'm an economist by background, for me the key issue is existing specializations, industrial or post-industrial, and changes of these specializations. And because of technological changes and changes of demand at the world market, some specializations gone and should be replaced by other ones. And in this process, there are cities which won and there are failures. So we should understand how it happens. Maybe when we do case studies of particular cities, not only cases of success, but also cases of failures, to understand why some cities succeeded to develop new specializations with higher level of knowledge, qualifications, and income, and some cities didn't success. Was it? I suppose that it is partly by chance, incidental, and partly because of some commitment and some political will, or I don't know, as a result of policy. But we should not exaggerate the influence of the policy. It is not everything depends on the will and on commitment, but something depends, and we should try to somehow evaluate this measure, because if we take our officials in Russia at local and regional level, at least, and at all levels, in case of success, when we have economic growth, they say that it's because of their good activities, you see. But when they have decline, they say that it's because of the world crisis. And so we are researchers, and we should try to evaluate this scientifically, at which extent really implementing policy can influence economic and social success. Yes, that's it.
Yeah, probably back to Sally. I think I mentioned that yesterday. That's quite important that we look at resilience for whom. Yeah, so that we look who is profiting from resilient strategies and actions, and who is driving these actions. So who are the actors behind? And I think we should take care of that also from this critical perspective. So who are actually the people who profit from resilient strategies, actions, and who are the drivers behind? I think that's a key issue we should look at. Yeah.
And I guess I'll finish up with maybe an attempt to be slightly optimistic in the face of Jim's cynicism. At least when I understand resilience and what this network might mean, and this is sort of a response as well to Vera and Sally, I don't think you could possibly investigate a place and be doing it honestly without having looked at the exploitive structures that existed there before and that gave rise to the kind of resilience that's being demanded of people now. Like I don't think as researchers we can sort of go blindly in and start with some kind of assumption about what resilience is or is not. Part of the value of having that institutional lens to look at things is that it brings the cultural piece in, that it forces us to really investigate ideology. And I think when you investigate ideology, that's what allows you to be more critical of neoliberalism, or to be more critical of what it means when we say empowerment. So in a lot of the work going forward, there's obviously the rhetoric of what we ask of people and what we expect to be done. There's the way that it gets expressed in formal policies. But I think we need to dig deeper than that and understand how that's rooted in a specific ideology that attaches to a place and that attaches to people, that might express even from the nation state filtering down in terms of how they've constructed life for these folks is very much influential of what their worldviews are going to be. When you have a network like this, what's nice about it, I think, is that as a researcher, I could try to do comparative work that looks at Australia or Russia and compares it to the US. And if I were to do that, I would get a very superficial sense of maybe what has been going on in those places, what exploitation has meant in those places. I might have a certain lens about what democratic participation looks like that would be informed through a very US-grounded lens. And maybe when people say democratic participation in Russia, that means a very different thing. I would imagine it does. So part of the value of having all of us is that we have bodies on the ground that are embedded in these contexts, right? We can be reflexive about what our own worldviews are and what the worldviews are of the communities that we live in and that we study. And we can really start to interrogate that in a way that's going to have some value and that's not going to allow this to just become yet another thing that says, all right, let's reify what resilience is and then see what it does in these different places. I think if we just go down that path, that it's not going to have much value. So hopefully in the future directions panel, once we get to hear from Joe and Chris sort of about this capacity building notion, I think maybe we can reflect on what are like some concrete steps or some specific projects that we try to take on that are going to allow us to both take advantage of maybe capacity that exists out there, but not lose that interest in being critical and taking advantage of the fact that we do have ideology and relationships and all of that embedded within the center of what this network is. So.
Yeah, I would like to add something to the debate. That's the first time I'm participating in the meeting, so I didn't have a chance to follow the whole length of the discussion as it evolved. What I find interesting and intellectually stimulating is that, of course, concepts can be used and abused in policy debates, and concepts come into fashion and go out of fashion. There is, nothing new about it. But I think what we can try to achieve, and this is I find interesting, that we can try to bridge areas that seem to address different problems, but in some sort of very isolated or isolated way. And resilience could be the concept that can help to link debates in evolutionary economic geography, but avoid the limitations of the focus on path dependency and equilibrium and rational thinking, and link evolutionary economic geography with political science debate, which explicitly look at agency and dynamics, process, decision making, turning points. So if you could look at, for example, political science frameworks, policy change, and then link it with evolutionary economic geography, and also adding some concepts and ideas from spatial planning, then we could potentially create something interesting that hasn't been done before. Yeah, I see that. I see the forum as a forum where these where these ideas can be developed and potentially lead to something interesting and new. And as for neoliberalism, of course, a lot of problems we are trying to address are a result of specific variation of capitalism that we live in. But my problem with neoliberalism debate is that it almost became some kind of combative term that instead of explaining and helping to understand various phenomena, tend to just put everything into one box, which is called neoliberalism, that doesn't really help to understand. Neo-Marxist geography doesn't seem to be interested. It is interested in the question of redistribution, flow of capital, but it is not interested in the question of how wealth is created. That's not their concern at all. And I think for many places, creation of wealth is a central question. What employment should be, should communities look for? What sources of growth? This is not what neoliberal geography debate can help us understand.
Okay, so please join me in thanking our panelists for a very provocative conversation. So we'll take about a 10-minute break. We're running a tiny bit behind schedule, but we'll take a 10-minute break, so come back in 10, not 11 minutes. Okay, you can have 11 if you need it. So you can have 11 minutes.
Yes. Yeah. We're not. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, well, the institutional, I don't think the institutional framework is that close-minded. I mean, like, that has always seemed very open to me, at least sociological. Well, like, there's been a lot of talk about specialization. then it's a very broad idea. I mean, but I mean, what's the problem with prison I don't think they're all different ones. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I don't say like it looks like maybe that's more yeah, they all. So if I were to give you like my it's that you have to have this so they understand how the different agents are acting and the ideology. So to me, like that needs to be the object of your study. Well, yeah. So like, like when I think of people, it was like they were potentially very open.
Well, I don't know how else they started. You cannot be, you just were forced to get it. It's terrible. I needed to
So like this is
policy at a global level, I'm like, of course this can't work. Others.
But I mean, it won't work because Paul Krugman was right, and global trade pours money and America's been the winner of it.
I know you agree with that, but
except that America's not done a good job of distributing it. It's a bestseller, a new bestseller list about something there to do more degree from Ohio and successful entrepreneurial self-made.
Oh, yeah. Oh, certainly, yeah. But because of the administration of it, people don't risk income. So they don't risk doing it. Yeah.
I mean, it really doesn't. The time variable is how long it takes. The traffic's not bad. Traffic is bad. Hey, Jen? Jen? You have the... Oh, there.
Yeah.
cat.
Right.
That was 10 years ago. That was 10 years ago, right?
It looks like you ought to be playing bass.
I know. It was. I was saying it was actually. It was actually taken.
Oh, that's part of the microphone.
So, I'm going to get a new one.
Okay.
I just found a picture of me. As I was looking at that yesterday, I wanted to go to get a new picture. I found a picture of me presenting Dave Chandler's biopolitics workshop at Westminster. That's a little bit more recent. I think I might use that one next time. I flipped it to the screen. Right. Yeah. Gotta work on that visual credibility thing, right?
Well, I like the picture. I wanted to hear you play.
People don't recognize me now.
It's just that if you show up for a date, you
Yeah.
say that you were.
Oh, you do so much housing work. Maybe not you personally, but
Well, I
Yeah.
do housing
Okay.
too.
okay, go grab a scone.
Bring everybody in. For these? Yeah. I told them that I'd sent them a bunch of questions, and so I'm just going to kind of pose those questions to them and let them go with that, rather than a formal thing.
I don't know how it is when you travel, but great that I got my flu shot in December.
I get mine too, but it's only 20% effective.
Well,
It helps, though. It does supposedly dampen it if you get it.
well, that's what I was going to say. I think that was sort of a miscalculation. Is that when they, in like say early December, January, said like, oh, it's only 20% effective, and a lot of people said, well, why should I get it?
Yeah.
As opposed to you get it, but you have this, so it's not going to be. I mean, if you do get it, it's not going to be as severe.
It's not as debilitating. I mean, there's a lot of people have died.
Oh, I know.
I think we're ready to get started here. I think. There's still some people outside, but here they come. This is the last of the formal panels, and then we're going to have a wrap-up session about next steps. What we thought when we put together the program here, that it was important to hear from individuals who worked outside of the academic world in a variety of capacities. So we're delighted to have two panelists today whom I have known and worked with over the past few years. To my immediate right is Chris Morrill, who is currently the CEO of the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States and Canada, which is a major organization. But I worked with Chris for a couple of years, I guess, or more, when he was city manager of Roanoke. We had at that time, and still do have, a consortium of universities of Virginia Tech, Hollins, and Roanoke College that are work on small city problems and small city growth and development. And Chris represented the city of Roanoke on that and worked with them. And anyone who knows anything about Roanoke knows that Chris is a visionary and had a lot to do with the success of the growth of Roanoke in the last 8 to 10 years. There's a wonderful article in Politico on Roanoke about 6 months ago. It's worth a read, and you'll see Chris highlighted there. The other individual is Joe Schilling, and I think Joe introduced himself before as being with the Urban Institute and a research fellow there, particularly in housing. But prior to that, Joe was at Virginia Tech as a practicing professor, or professor of practice, we call him, in the planning program located up here, and was with us for a number of years. And then Joe, I believe it was the first workshop we did in Davos was at, and gave a presentation on Cleveland and regeneration in Cleveland housing. So those are our two panelists, and what I thought I had contacted them earlier and suggested that I pose some questions to them rather than necessarily having to give a formal presentation. Joe has some slides that he will show you in connection with some of these, but I thought the way we would work is let me ask them the questions and then they can respond to them at an appropriate time. If you want to follow up with them on their response, that would be fine. We did not ask them here because they are funding agencies, because they'll tell you, I don't have any money, we go out and get money. But they do represent a very important group of practitioners out there that have been involved with this subject for some time. So let me start by the first question, or two questions they can ask. I asked them, what aspects of resilience most interest your organizations, and how important is resilience to your institution's future programming? So, Chris, do you want to start, or Joe?
I'll stand up so I can see everybody. You know, resilience is critical, and first let me thank you all for letting me be here with you. In many ways, you speak a different language than I do, but it's it's been good for me to be exposed to this. And I think when I look at resilience, one of the critical things we're working on, and in the second question I'll get into a little bit more detail, is how do you give community actors the leadership skills so they can lead resiliency? I mean, it takes long-term thinking. It takes real change. And so I've been trying to work a lot on leadership with our members. So GFO we have about 20,000 members. We represent state, local. In the U.S., we have local utilities and other things. So about 20,000 members, school boards. And I've been really trying to help them see that the finance officer, because of the skills that she or he brings and the power that they have, the power of the budget, can really bring change to a community. Finance people are often looking backwards, which is what accounting does, trying to get them to look forward with 5-year, 10-year, 20-year sustainability plans, resiliency plans. And so we've been moving from a model of the heroic leader, is how most people see leadership. In the U.S., I use the example of Teddy Roosevelt, charging up San Juan Hill on his horse with all the troops running behind him. That kind of leadership doesn't work with the complex issues that we're facing, with poverty, with the opioid crisis, with school outcomes, whatever they are. So moving to initially, I think the concept of meta leadership, which you're probably familiar with, that Len Marcus and Bill Dorn did out of the Harvard Kennedy School and the Public Health School, where they looked at areas of disaster where leadership was actually able to bring about change pretty quickly. And they called that meta leadership, which is really about building trust among the silos before the event occurs. So we've expanded that some to the concept of collaborative leadership. And I think if you think of collaborative leadership in terms of what you all do, if you think about resiliency, so you know, what the academic research can bring to the table can be huge. And what you can do to help communities is first, you know, you all know how to use data. You can help communities with evidence-based programming, which is really how it should be. As a city manager, I spent most of my days answering complaints about trash collection or parking tickets. Didn't have a lot of time to spend on the critical long-term things. But having partners like Virginia Tech, Roanoke College, Hollins University, to help us with that evidence-based approach can make a tremendous difference. So you can really, in the collaborative leadership model with local government, with academia, with the private sector, with the nonprofit sector, and then what you can bring is best practices around the world. I mean, often to implement something, we need some stories about where things have worked in other places, and to bring that to us in a way that we can then implement and hopefully then learn from that to improve it. And that's something that my organization does a lot of. And then I think third is that that really direct engagement in local government. I think for a university like Virginia Tech, which in the U.S. we have, they're called land-grant universities, founded by the Morrill Act back in the late 1800s, which, so the university doesn't just have an education mission, but it has a community building mission. Virginia Tech took that very seriously, so they reached out to Roanoke, they're not even located in Roanoke, to help us with our community building. And the brain power that you have to help make that happen can be really huge. So if you think of that collaborative leadership model where you can help with that, communities can make a difference. My role now at the national level is to partner with universities, and I'll talk about some of the things we've done with that, to have some applied research that we can then test and pilot, you know, from some of our 20,000 members. We can then pilot those, learn more from them, and then tell those stories. We make that available to members, non-members, if we can see some improvement there. So I think for me, it's really that leadership. How do you bring change? And for resiliency, to get communities thinking that way, I don't know if any of you have read any of the Heath work. They have a book called Switch about how to bring change. Talk about it at the community level. And they talk about change in the terms, the visual they use is an elephant with a rider. And if you think of that rider trying to steer the elephant, the rider is the intellect. It's a lot about what you do. The elephant's the emotion, and then the path will guide them. Now, where we can help with the path is there are interesting things happening of all places in accounting, where we're looking at new ways to account for investments like bioswales that will reduce the cost of treating water later or flooding, and so that can help create the path, but it's really the elephant, the emotion that you have to focus on. So I think the challenge for all of us is how do we take what we do, which is so critical, using data, looking at best practices, and turn that into stories that can change the emotions so we can actually steer that elephant toward resiliency. Because I think the elephant's just trampling down all kinds of stuff right now in our community. And I think it's at the local government level that's going to happen. So hyper-partisan at the national and the federal level that the local government is where you're going to have the innovation and where, I mean, you're already investing your time and talents there. So that's it. I think really leadership is the key piece that I really want to work on.
Thank you, Chris. Joe?
I was going to talk about peanuts as as for the elephant, but I couldn't figure out how to get that into my presentation. So, the Urban Institute it's huge. It's 500 people, and in many ways, it was set up with an academic model. So, as a non-partisan, non-governmental research organization that focuses on urban issues. It's coming up on its 50th anniversary. So it was chartered coming out of the Great Society with then President Johnson. So very different than today. There was sort of an acceleration and expansion of the federal government's role in housing and social services. And as they had this proliferation of federal programs, many which still exist, are hanging on by a thread today, there was concern about whether those programs would be effective. And so the Urban Institute initially was chartered in order to do program evaluation around social and housing, or social health and housing policy. And so within the Institute now, there are 11 different centers. I talk about them as the urban nation. And there are 11 different tribes in the urban nation. So you have health policy, justice. So people were talking about the opioid crisis, and in some ways how resilience could be applied to that. So you've got researchers that are doing work around that crisis, health policy, the fiscal health of state and local governments. So I'm situated in a new center at the Urban Institute, which I think gets at this issue of intersection between practice, research, and policy. And it's called the Research to Action Lab, or the Lab. And it's the goal is really to work with some of the researchers at Urban and sort of Urban's core mission of doing this kind of evidence-based program evaluation, and work directly with policymakers in trying to stand up some of the recommendations in their analysis. So as researchers, you do your work, you do your analysis, you make sure that it's methodologically sound, and it gets published. And if a policymaker or someone else happens to pick up your idea, that's great. But again, even within academia as it is in Urban, there wasn't a lot of resources to go out and try to cultivate, plant the seed of your research in a particular place with a policymaker, and then help stand up the recommendation. Because for a lot of researchers, that's not what you do. That's not an area that you're comfortable with, right? You want to do the analysis, you get one publication, you do a conference, you do a symposium, you move on. So this is sort of a new focus for the Institute to be able to try to make research more actionable, sort of what I call sort of engaged research. Now within Urban, there are as I say, part of this nation, there are several researchers who are looking at the issues of resilience in the very traditional sense, what I would say as far as disasters, sort of the natural environment. Carlos Martin is doing a program evaluation funded by the Rockefeller Foundation for the 100 RC initiative. He just completed earlier this year an analysis of the federal government had a competition on resilience. So there was leftover federal funds from one of the hurricanes, I think it was Hurricane Sandy, and so they created a competition for cities to, here in the U.S., to do some kind of resilience strategies. And so, again, his expertise is, you know, what I would say in this bullseye of the traditional context of resilience and how many of you have been thinking about it, as well as how the practice really evolved from. There is a whole other group of researchers, of which I'm probably more closely connected with, that are looking at the recovery of cities. So under the sort of broader umbrella of inclusive recovery, or it really has grounding in the issues of social equity and inclusion, knowing that coming out of the Great Recession, which, again, if you apply the resilience model to that economic crisis or economic disaster, there's some cities who have recovered, have reached some sort of new state of equilibrium, but there are many cities, particularly smaller cities, who have not. Now, that may not be directly tied to deindustrialization as we think about it, but the crisis here in terms of the foreclosure crisis, the meltdown with some of the financial firms in the U.S. also led to a lot more instability with local governments, the financial instability. So that in itself has played in to this kind of economic, I would say, sort of post-industrial or sort of post-economic crisis narrative. So there's a number of projects at Urban looking at indicators, which cities have recovered and why. There's a whole new initiative connected to understanding who has been left behind, whether that's on the scale of smaller cities or particularly communities of color. And I would say another dimension that we've been trying to make the connection with is health. So I, for the last couple of years, have been participant in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a national healthcare foundation here in the U.S., with their what initiative it's called their Interdisciplinary Leaders initiative. And so there are 15 cities, each of them focused on, in this case, the first call was on housing. But in each of these research projects, there are 2 researchers and a community partner. And I think that may be kind of an interesting model for you all as you go forward and think about next steps. And so our project that I'm working on is in Memphis with a community partner, with an intermediary, and we're looking at substandard housing and the public health impacts from that substandard housing, and we're doing a health impact assessment. And the reason I raise this is, again, the model of having this partnership between researchers and community folks. And as a cohort, we get together every week with webinars, we get together every quarter, and there's a lot of learning between community partners and the researchers. And I would say each one is sort of pushing the bounds of their level of comfort in this research, but the idea is that the research project should further what that community partner is doing. And so there's a lot of learning about, the community partner, about research and what that means, as well as for the researchers to understand, well, what does it really mean to do sort of, participatory research as a methodology? And anyway, so again, I think that's another dimension as you all think about the sort of post-industrial city context, is not only economic. I've heard here over the last day and a half a lot of focus on the community and sort of the civic infrastructure. Chris has mentioned leadership. I would also add into that mixed public health.
Great. Before I move on to the second question, time for just a couple of questions or comments on this dimension of it. I thought it was, I really like what you just said, Joe, about the researcher and the community, this kind of connecting to the real world problems that exist out there. And I think we tend to move along in a true multidisciplinary way when we are faced with the problem rather than trying to deal with an abstraction. And I think that's critical. Any comments or questions? Okay. The second question I gave them is, do you have specific programs for developing resilience policy? And if so, what are they? And who do you collaborate with in terms of research on resilience? So, Chris?
I'll name 4 programs, but then go into more detail in one, because I think it's probably most interesting to you all. One, we are working with FEMA, with the American Planning Association, International City Managers Association, and some other state and local government associations on helping prepare communities for disasters. So we do something like, we call it risk-based reserve analysis, where we'll come in and help communities figure what level of reserves do you need based on the possible risks that you'll find. And we use a data analysis tool to do that. And then we're also helping with training with that. So, how can you recover more quickly? We're a partner with the Rockefeller Resilient Cities. We kind of bring in that financial aspect. We're working with Rutgers University on some of the accounting changes that I mentioned, on how we might be able to drive some changes if you have to account for things like sea level rise or other things that might impact your community. Bond rating agencies are now considering that. So as cities get downgraded in their bonds, they're going to start taking this stuff more seriously too. So we're helping with that. But the one I wanted to focus in on most is we've created something called the Financial Sustainability Index. And I think this is a good model of how you can take from the academic to the applied. So the Lincoln Land Institute came to us and said they're very interested in Eleanor Ostrom's common pool resource theory, starting with the tragedy of the commons, and then, it's this shared resource that everyone has an incentive to overuse. And so, she won a Nobel Prize because she came up with leadership principles and then guidelines on how you can make that work. So the Lincoln Land Institute came to us and said, well, could you take this common pool resource theory and apply it to a city budget? If you think about it, budget is a finite resource. Everyone has an incentive to take as much out of it they can, whether it's the police or the unions or the Parks and Rec folks. Everybody wants as much out of it. So if you could apply the common pool resource theory to the budget, could you help people think really more long term? We call it sustainability because that's what Ostrom called it. I think I prefer resiliency, but somebody gave me the example, do you want your marriage to be sustainable? Would you rather have it be resilient? And so I think resilience is probably a better term, but we wanted to stay true to Ostrom's work there. So the way that is, so we took her theory, and then we partnered with some researchers or academicians from USC and from University of San Francisco to see what can we take from that. And we were very true to her 6 leadership principles, and then there's 8 guidelines that she used, institutional design guidelines. And we got some communities, and we actually applied those in there. And then we've come out with an initial research report that we've done. And now we've gone to the next step where through our membership, I've gone out, I've talked about this at our conferences, and we've looked for volunteers from well-run governments who would then want to take this to the next stage and really come through. So they've come in and we've trained them. A lot of it is really on how to build trust. So it's about leadership. It's about how to build trust in a community. How do you set up guidelines so everyone will be engaged? I think it really can be transformative in communities, and making sure everyone's at the table and they feel comfortable and they're honored. And so we're using a group called Liberating Structures. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but some really great community engagement tools that they have. So we brought finance officers and city managers into our office. We've now taken over the funding. Lincoln Land Institute a little bit still involved. We've kept USC, San Francisco on board to then do the good data analysis as we're going through this. We've trained the first cohort. We're training a second cohort. They're now going and applying these. We're connecting with them. And then usually how this plays out, because we've done this on education budgeting reforms also, is then once we have 5 to 10 case studies, we will then update our research paper, and then we'll turn that into tools and best practices that we will then make available through training, through publications, and that we make available to anybody, whether they're a member or not. So the hope is, so you started with this academic concept, and then we brought it down through really applied, and then through our network, we have the ability to then distribute that widely. And we have some international affiliates we're going to share that with also. Hopefully we may be able to test this a little bit internationally too. But anyway, so it's called Fiscal Sustainability Index. If you get on our website, gofwa.org, click into research, you can get a copy of our paper, and we're now turning it into a small book with some of the early case studies in it.
Joe?
I'm going to show a couple of slides, but I wanted to follow up on what Chris was saying, because I think part of the post-industrial narrative here in the U.S. has kind of ignored the fiscal stability of local governments, and certainly the bankruptcy in Detroit was not only national but caught international attention. They've come through that now, but still all the research I've seen is that, there are more cities who will be heading that way, and I'm not sure the current president's budget is going to help them avoid bankruptcy. So let's see. Okay, it's going to skip through a few things. So part of, I think, a task that you have is you try to identify what you're working on. And this, again, I'll sort of highlight some of the things that they're going on at the Urban Institute, but it seems to me that one of the tasks is to understand the current landscape of which organizations out there are working in this space. And I would say the space that it seems that many of you have operated in is it's really multiple spaces, and that's what in many ways makes your task all the more exciting and challenging. So some of you come at this from the resilience field, and as Jim talked about, sort of the disaster preparedness and disaster mitigation and recovery. Now, trying to apply that model in this context of post-industrial cities, is it economics? So there's a lot of complexities there. So I think it's important to understand, who's working in that space. So I mentioned earlier Carlos Martin, who is doing work around sort of traditional resilience. This is his report on the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And at urban.org, which is our website, we have things that are called collection pages or features. And so like this feature about disaster is a compilation of different blogs that researchers have written as well as different reports. But I wanted to call attention to this report by Rolf Pendel, who was Maggie's, dissertation chair at Cornell. Rolf recently was one of my bosses heading the Metropolitan Communities and Housing Center. But this was sort of an overview, kind of a trend analysis of the future of the states around the Great Lakes. And it was funded by the Joyce Foundation. Now, the Joyce Foundation, which is based in Chicago, for many years had been supporting research and capacity building activities around the environment. So resilience was really part of some of the work that they had supported. This report was not looking at the environment. So this was looking at the resilience and the trends with education, out-migration, social services, health, as a way to sort of connect the environmental, sort of the place-based strategies that often post-industrial cities, that's often the first thing they do. Not to say that it's easier, but it's easier sometimes to worry about how to deal with an inventory of thousands of vacant and abandoned properties than it is to fix the school systems in Detroit or in Cleveland. So this report was an intended audience, was really for the foundation, to say how are you going to shift your investments to take a more holistic view at the future of the Great Lakes beyond just the environment. Of course, this was in some ways seeded by a network. And again, this is Rolf, Erica Pothig, who also works at the Urban Institute. Maggie was part of a network of researchers building resilient regions that was housed at the University of California at Berkeley, but it was a network that commissioned a variety of papers around the different dimensions of resiliency. So, again, looking at it from a regional angle, looking at it from an economic angle, looking at it for a variety of different perspectives. And again, it was more, I would say, still focused on the research and trying to create some kind of community voice around those, or sort of grounding the opportunity for a community voice around those issues. This collection page is where I'm doing a lot of work, which is in Detroit. A number of research projects are funded by the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation. So J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the largest financial institutions in the U.S. and abroad, has roots in Detroit. Who knew? So part of the story, and I think, again, that's critical as you think about your work. What is the story that the research tells? Part of the story in Detroit in terms of their current renaissance is that this role of philanthropy, whether it's the Kresge Foundation or J.P. Morgan Chase that's invested over $150 million. And so what Urban is doing is we're working on different components, certainly housing, analysis around capital flows, but then we're also trying to build capacity. So one of the projects I'm working on is helping them create a housing compact. It's a group about this size of organizations, including the city and the county and NGOs, private sector, to try to create a regular working group to advance different housing policy strategies. So again, understanding where some of this current work is happening and what the focus is, whether it's a city or a foundation. Another foundation, as I mentioned yesterday, the Kresge Foundation. They were founded in Detroit, but they, over the last 10 years, as they've been helping support the renaissance of Detroit and supporting, the city, helping support the NGOs, they are now trying to expand their focus. So now they have, under this label of American Cities Practice, they're identifying different cities in which they hope to kind of take the lessons from Detroit and their investments and the research and the capacity building that's happened there and apply it to other cities. So some of that has actually now started to trickle into Memphis. There's some other cities that they're also looking at. So great, there are people occupying this space that aren't necessarily at the national level. So this is the Greater Ohio Policy Center. This is an NGO in Columbus. It focuses on state policy just in the state of Ohio. And they have been connected to a national network of NGOs and academic researchers around what do you do about legacy cities. Now you might think what is a legacy city? So the legacy city term or brand came out of a convening in 2011, 2012, where the American Assembly, another NGO, brought a bunch of people to Detroit to say, what are we going to do about post-industrial cities in the U.S.? And there was a group of researchers who had come from Europe who had created the Shrinking Cities Research Network, which I think still exists. I think the director of that is at the university in Kaiserslautern. So the reason they ended up changing the name is that it's hard for Americans to think about anything small, right? I mean, it's, the whole history of America is about expansion and growth. And so to be able to take the research and the lessons in this network and share that, policymakers say, well, I can't be part of a shrinking city network. Researchers, you can call it what you want. And so I raise that again as you think about issues of, naming, is it post-industrial? Is it deindustrialization? So in some ways, this has become in the U.S. kind of an umbrella term. If you are part of a legacy city, a city that really has an industrial heritage, but is going through this tremendous economic and social transformation and change. So this group in Ohio now is focusing on the smaller cities and towns in that state and what they're doing. And this is even kind of a more interesting example. This is the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So within the U.S., in terms of our banking structure, we have the Federal Reserve Bank, which sets monetary policy. And there are 11 different regional banks underneath sort of the umbrella of the Federal Reserve Bank. And so they, in addition to the state of Massachusetts, also started to adopt policies to what do we do about the towns that are 20,000, 30, 5, 10,000, the smaller towns that in Massachusetts or in Pennsylvania or Ohio were at one time part of a huge industrial network, but have since, of course, that industrial network, no longer exists. And so they're not the big cities which often get a lot of attention like the Detroit and the Clevelands. So this Federal Reserve Bank actually sponsored a challenge. It created its own network of smaller cities who could apply for grants to do some capacity building around leadership. And as the Federal Reserve Bank also has a research arm, they're doing their own program evaluation and trying to track the progress. Is this infusion of technical assistance and capacity building and resources making a difference? So, there's a lot of other examples I can provide, but I think this kind of gives you a little bit of the landscape to understand there are other organizations out there who have, I think, aligned interests. They may not call it resilience, but I think there could be an opportunity to connect with them.
Thank you, Joe. Questions for Chris or Joe on this? One of the, I think, important takeaways from what you just heard, particularly for those of us who are in the United States, but it also may apply to Europe. There is a funding landscape out there that is very, very different than the traditional academic thinks about. I mean, if you're at a university, we all know about NSF, you know about NIH, you know about NIST, you maybe know about DARPA, all of those federal agencies. There are literally hundreds of foundations that sponsor work. My experience has been that a lot of those foundations want you to partner with either an organization like Chris or the Urban Institute because they trust them. And it's not that they don't trust you, but they don't know you. So one of the strategies I think you have to adopt is to work with organizations like Chris's or the Urban Institute or others to partner to go to these organizations, to go to Robert Wood Johnson or other kinds of. I have some personal familiarity with Robert Wood Johnson, and believe me, if they haven't worked with you before, they won't work with you. So you have to bring in somebody they know, right? So it's an important kind of lesson to learn, particularly if you're a young researcher trying to go out and find dollars, because the federal dollar landscape is getting sparse, as we all know. Okay, the last question I posed to them, and to some extent they've already addressed it, I think Joe has, but what types of research or outreach would be most useful to your organization's goals?
Yeah, and I think a theme I heard throughout yesterday and today is this idea of citizen engagement. What is real citizen engagement that gets at not just the typical actors who show up, but really gets into communities who may have been disadvantaged in the past, or I know in Roanoke, urban renewal devastated the community, and in fact, there's a great book called Root Shock, where a psychologist looked at the impact of urban renewal, which uprooted people, and choose the root shock when you uproot a plant, that it not only affects that generation, but future generations. And so, is there anybody out there who is really, I told you Liberating Structures has some great tools. I would recommend it if you all are looking at some citizen engagement, but I'd love to see some real work on who is really connecting with these communities. Often, these folks may be working 2-3 jobs. They don't have time for this. How do we engage them positively and make them feel welcome at the table and give them a role to play? So I'd love to see some work on citizen engagement. I think also some case studies on regional approach. I think we recognize that most small communities, they can't these issues cross boundaries, whether it's environmental or public health or whatever it may be. Some real research on some regional approaches that have been successful, and not just what was the approach, but how did they build the capital and the trust across those jurisdictions? What are some structures they had in place that made that successful? So regional approach. And then I think I would love to see this concept of meta leadership, which is about disaster preparedness and disaster response, applied to resiliency, where the concept of, if you could really have public safety, public health, urban planning, infrastructure planning, economic development, budgeting and finance, these different silos, if you could have resiliency as a cross-cutting theme across it, what might that look like? So I think, this concept of creating a resiliency officer is great, but then the rest of the organization may be, well, that's her job. That's the resiliency officer's job. I don't have to think about it because she's doing it. And it's funny because we've done some pre-conference sessions, which have been pretty popular with our members, where we've brought in the resiliency officers. We had the one from Boulder, and I think from Virginia Beach or Norfolk. But anyway, they talked about how they feel isolated there because people just don't see it as their role. So how can we get in and help those different disciplines see that resiliency is something that should just be part of everything that they do? It shouldn't be something extra that they filter they apply after they put their programs together, but how do they start from an idea of, is this building the community now and in the future, and does everybody take part in that? So I'd love to see some case studies and models and some great stories we can tell about that, where it's made a difference in communities.
Thank you. Joe?
So I'm going to go back to a couple slides.
You can tell Joe had an academic background.
That's right.
He's got those PowerPoints.
Well, I got excited last night when I was starting to think about, I don't want, this is, I guess what I would say is and this comes from some experience. About 10 years ago, I got an initial grant, got it renewed from the Ford Foundation to do work around vacant properties. And that's really what has allowed me to go into the communities, the post-industrial communities of which many of you talked about. And we created what I would say is an informal network. So this was an informal network of practitioners and researchers at different universities in, predominantly the classic Rust Belt communities. Detroit, at Wayne State, and University of Michigan in Flint, Cleveland State in Cleveland, University of Buffalo. We had a variety of researchers, all at different levels. Some who were very senior and well-published, as well as, rising stars. That was when Maggie was a rising star. Now she's a star. The reason I am sort of sharing part of the experience I've had in building this network is sometimes it's less about the content and the substance of your research, and it's more about how it's packaged and shared. So we had a series, and they're still online, as we go through kind of a transformation of the network now coming within the Urban Institute's family of initiatives. But we still have an independent website, and we went through the process of doing translation briefs. So in some ways, if I was to, put my academic hat on, it's really more of like an annotated bibliography for practitioners. But it synthesizes recommendations. So when we talk about the greening of legacy cities, it looks at, an incredibly rich, an comprehensive body of literature from the natural sciences and social sciences, and all dealing with folks who are out there researching the effort in a lot of legacy cities to take vacant and abandoned land and do something green, whether it's green infrastructure in order to do some of the, we'll say, classic resilience, or urban agriculture, or just minimizing crime. Researchers at the University of Philadelphia at the medical school have now published extensively about if you green a vacant lot in an urban setting, it has an important reduction of certain crimes in terms of assault and weapons offenses and things like that. They've done the research. but no one as a practitioner gets access to that academic journal because they don't have access to academic publishers or an academic library. So the translation brief was a way to do that. So in terms of thinking about what kind of research is needed, sometimes it's less, I guess my point is it's less about the content and it's more about the ability to synthesize your different perspectives. And some of that, again, may be difficult, but identifying particular problems in these post-industrial cities, whether that's fiscal health, is it something like urban greening, is it something like the capacity of these local governments? Again, all of you have your academic disciplines, but grounded in these communities. And the scale, is it looking at regional solutions and what some of the barriers may be to regional collaboration? Or is it that small town? What can that small town do to be more resilient and bring in jobs or even just stabilize? But think about different ways of doing that. And so one of the things we tried to do, and this is just focused on vacant property, is we tried to create kind of a diagnostic. And so it was like looking at, what are, based on our case studies, based on our work with these different communities, what are like the 4 sort of key components of what we called was this sort of model vacant property policy system. I mean, this is, sort of like an ecological model light in a way. And so we identified these and had examples. So as Chris mentioned, we could help tell the policy story to say, oh, hey, in Cleveland, they had a network of a partnership with the university to create a data system. And so now they know where all the vacant and foreclosed homes are at any minute. And they can sit down tactically with the city land bank to figure out which. So that was a key component. Then they understood that they had to go through and reform state and local laws to create a more sort of, again, we might say resilient policy system so that they know when the next foreclosure crisis comes and there will be other, our next housing crisis comes, they will be better prepared for that. But what was driving this was the collaborative network. And so as you look at your individual pieces, thinking about, how could we put these pieces together into a descriptive model, right, that could help a leader, whether they're at the community or local government level, in a post-industrial city, connect the dots. I mean, that's essentially what this model does, is it helps a practitioner connect the dots. And I think it may even be a good tool for this group, right? As you each have individual ideas, how can we create something that could help connect the dots? So again, my comments are less about what and more about some ideas for how you guys could go about doing this.
Thank you, Joe. Questions now that we're at the end here for any of these folks? Thank you. I had a couple of comments to make. Number one, it's interesting not only from this panel, but all the previous panels, I think one word seems to be very common, and that's the issue of trust. Building trust and how you do that is essential, I think, to achieving some of your goals. The second kind of thing I think you heard is how do practitioners and academics engage with one another in meaningful ways. You run the spectrum from the academic who sits in his or her lab and walks home at night and doesn't worry about the rest of the world, to along that spectrum to the other end where you have folks in the practitioner community who don't worry about what's going on in the academic world. And so the question is, how do you connect them? And I think there's not one model, there are different models. One of the things I think that hasn't been said here that's a great opportunity, and I think we see a couple examples of it here, is how do you engage your students out in the community? The kind of outreaching of students. I know CL and Maggie teach it down, and Tom have taught labs that are community-based labs. where the problems that are defined are not by the academic, but by the community. Help us solve this problem. And that's one way. We experimented on a way up here, and it's still going on, yet to be finalized, is what we call embedding faculty, where we'll take a faculty member and put them out for a month, 2, 3, 4 in an agency and say, that's your job, is to work with them and totally be part of that community. It's the equivalent, we call it the hospital model, the medical hospital model. You know, if you're in medical school, at some point you're an intern and you have to go out and work in a hospital. That's what the idea is. You send students out. Students are our best, as an academic speak, students are our best resources in many cases for making that connection, and we need to take advantage of that. So I really appreciate the thoughts you brought to the group. I think, as you see, there are lots of opportunities out there to work with communities. There are actually lots of opportunities in working with communities to find funding. CL, you have, yeah. I do have one question. Here, CL's question is, where do I line up for the funding? Isn't it?
Right. Well, it more relates to going back to this translational piece that Joe, you just showed. I'm curious to know, Chris, you can answer this question too in your new role. Maybe talk a little bit about the importance of translational research down to the community, you know, community members as also practitioners and the community member as a scholar. And how do you guys look at, like, where not all knowledge is generated from, you know, the academic tower, but how do you actually involve the knowledge that's generated at the community level in these processes?
Yes, I'll give one example. And I would say sometimes it's really hard for researchers to think that, you know, we'll just call the community or the neighborhood knowledge is important. Right, so I mean, it's part of getting over that. So I'd say a good example is with this health impact assessment that we're doing in Memphis, the health impact assessment process, I mean, which is really a traditional engagement, it's a planning process, but they're assessing health impacts. And so that framework, in addition to partnering with a very trusted community development intermediary who then has trusted relationships with sort of key neighborhood leaders. And so I think it's twofold. Is one, we had sort of a research methodology that it was putting sort of community knowledge as a priority, and two, having that trusted partner, because again, even if it's you're doing research in your own community as a university professor or institute, it's often hard. I mean, you may not have credibility or trust. So having someone that you can, you know, partner with who has that trust. And then the third thing is making sure that whatever you come up with really does have impact, right? That it's not just you're trying to extract the knowledge. In fact, there was someone the other day was writing a piece about community participation, and they used the word extract, and the community folks and the researchers said, like, whoa, wait a second, you know, you may not be aware that, you know, using that term says you're taking something, what are you giving back to us? So I think at the very end, making sure that your analysis and recommendations will have some impact.
Yeah, but first just a comment about trust, because I think you're right. Interesting, so Ostrom's second leadership strategy in her common pool resource theory is help participants to build trustworthy relationships. I thought it was interesting. It's not about you be trustworthy yourself, but your role is to help others build their own trustworthiness. And so if you think about that as you're working with people, how do you connect them together? But back to your question, I have an example which I think speaks to that, and it wasn't intentional at all. It just kind of happened. But in Roanoke, what we do with our community development block grant funds, it's federal funds. We don't get very much of them. They've been cut in half over the last 10 years. But we, rather than sprinkle them around the community, we target them. And so we were targeting an area called the West End. And just happened that a professor at Roanoke College who was doing a course on the urban environment and public health brought her students, she heard about that without telling us at all, brought her students to that community and had them map out all of the sidewalks, their conditions, and how do you connect to parks and to schools and to libraries and to other community resources. So you can picture these group of students out in this, fairly poor neighborhood, and people are sitting on their porch like, what is going on here? And so eventually they see these students out there, and the professor, they started talking to each other, they got to know each other, and they even asked, well, where would your children go to the park, and why aren't they going there now? And then after doing all this, they met with me and said, hey, we've mapped out where you should invest your community development block grant funds, and this is what the community said, and if you put ramps here, and the sidewalk is in horrible condition, and there's no sidewalk here at all, and the lighting here is poor, so kids won't go out at night, and so we used that, and I've got a connection with her, and we then started working on a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Invest Health grant, where we brought in other community partners. And so by her just kind of stepping out and doing it, she is now part of the Small Cities Initiative, also, that Virginia Tech and Hollins University are doing. So I would say if there's opportunities just to get out there and do something and then share that information, I think that there's lots of opportunities for more collaboration now because of that one small step that she took.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to have the next group right now, or are you going to take a break, or what?
Yeah, let's do just until you take a short break, and then lunch is at 12:30. So we'll just have some closing remarks.
Right now?
In 10 minutes, yeah. Let's do people a chance to stretch.
Could I suggest we do it now? Because if you turn them loose, you'll never get them. Yeah. And they haven't set up the food yet, but why don't we do it right now? Yeah. It's you and Jen, right?
And you.
Oh.
Okay. You're ready.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, great job.
Yeah.
Maggie, too? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's just take a short break.
All right, very short break. Stay here if you don't have to go, so.
I should say, let me put that in. I don't remember yours.
Joe. Right on, thank you. That was great.
Yeah.
So what they did HIA it's still relatively
We'll meet in the lobby of the hotel at 3:30 to get a cab down to Union Station. Is that okay? That'll give us plenty of time just in case the traffic is bad. Okay? 3:30. Yeah, so you get time to kind
Are you taking the bus?
Huh?
Are you taking the bus?
No, we're taking the train back.
So that's why this is your kid's website. That's part of the story. No, let me know what you exactly sent us. We'll have a senior housing. Just in the city.
What do you want? You gonna go first?
I might want to go last, but I mean, what are you going to say?
I'm not sure, really. Just kind of thanks for coming and.
I mean, I can talk to you about what I was going to say. Yeah. I mean, I was going to talk about what it is that we're hoping to get from them, thinking about like moving forward with this.
I think you ought to go first.
Yeah. And then sort of, yeah.
Yeah. Then why don't you, then Jen, and I'll just. And I'll just.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just the closing remarks.
I'll be closing remarks. Yeah. You go first. And then, yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I would.
Don't get too cynical. If you can help.
No, I won't.
Don't repeat whatever that was earlier.
Huh?
I need them to leave with some optimism.
Chris and Joe would have been.
What? Yeah, that helped. Just going to give a couple people a little more time to come back here so that we don't start talking without Leonid and Vera and some of them. So.
Support and
Yeah. What? No. No, I would never do that. Maggie. No, I mean, there's conversations everywhere. So it's. All right, yeah. All right. So I can see that lunch is being set up out there. So what I'm going to try to do here, and I'm not sure if it's possible, but we've heard a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different ideas about the ways that this network could evolve. Some of that has been built around critical theory. Some of that has been built around like what's the scale at which we work. How do we think about resilience? How do we think about the role of individuals? So there's a lot to unpack. And Jim is actually going to be talking after me, and he assured me that he will not say anything too cynical about the network and its possibilities. So I'm hopeful that he'll remain optimistic, and I'll try to remain optimistic as well. So based on everything that I've been hearing, I think there's a few guiding principles that we can come out with. So I'll talk about those, and then I'll talk about just on this notion of extraction, and maybe not using that as a good word going forward, but things that we might in the network like to see extracted from all of you in terms of your knowledge of the different places and what the work is that you've been doing, and then what we'll try to give out to you that will help keep the network going forward. So on the guiding principles piece, two things kept coming up in all of this. One was the notion of engagement. All right, and I think we've just heard this in the last panel. It came through yesterday. I think it comes through in the theory as well that if we're doing good work on resilience, it has to be engaged. It has to be heavily embedded in individual places. And when we think about the value of an institutional perspective, especially one grounded in sociology, that's very much about embeddedness. It's about understanding how individuals and communities work, and then making sure that as researchers we actually are doing the kind of work that engages them, that genuinely engages them, that tries to take their knowledge and not just treat it as a thing to be remolded and reconfigured according to our own perspective, but that we actually treat it honestly as a real empirical object. So I think the engagement piece, whether you want to call this applied research or participatory research, depending on where you're from, that's one of the guiding principles of the network. The other goes to this issue of scale and how we orient ourselves. We've heard regional development perspectives. We've heard discussion of individual affect and hope. We've gone up from the nation down through the state, down to local. We've included NGOs. Like, there's all these actors. I think Sebastian did a good job of saying, like, just how long was the list of different actors that Tom talked about, and which levels we could possibly work at. And so when we think about like what's the unit of analysis that we want to work on, I'd like to propose that we focus on community as the unit of analysis. I think one of the values of that term is that it's actually scalable up and down, right? We can think of communities occurring at multiple geographies. It doesn't have to be just a neighborhood community. We can think of how a community operates at an entire city level. We could go beyond that to the region. We can think of it as a community of organizations or as a community of individuals. So going forward, if we sort of use that as our jumping off point, how do we define a community for resilience purposes? And then once we've defined that, what's the kind of research that we can do around it? The third piece is really to have to do with data and the development of what data might look like. I think there's a lot that we still haven't gathered if we're looking at, again, post-industrial places from an institutional perspective. We might know a lot about laws or rules, so we might like really have a lot of good information about regulative structures. We probably have a lot of good demographic data and socioeconomic data as well. But what we don't have is a lot of good data on norms and informal rules, like the ways that people actually relate to each other, and culture as well, and how we might operationalize that. So one of the things, like I know this is something that a lot of us in this room have actually tried to measure on our own, but ensuring that can be translated across settings requires that we have some consistency in how we think of what these measures are going to be and how we're actually going to get that information and use it in a comparative way. So those are kind of like some guiding principles. And so now I'm going to talk about what we'd want to extract from all of you as we're coming out of this network. And this is something where we'll send you a request and try to get information about the work that you do. And what we're going to ask for is what are some of the different sources that you rely on for getting at all of these different pieces of data that we're interested in trying to collect together into one uniform place that will actually allow good research to be done going forward. And I'm talking about sort of the kind of nuanced data that we hope to get, the stuff that you can't get just from looking at a census, for example. The second is understanding what your community engagement practices look like. What are the organizations that you've worked with? How have you partnered with them? How have you incorporated this into the pedagogy that you do? And I think out of that, what we'd hope to get is a model for how community engagement looks in this network. Part of that would also be understanding who the different funders are that you use. One of the realities of research is that you need to have it supported somehow. And I think we've heard a lot of really good information from Joe and Chris today about what the American landscape looks like for that. And so from the folks in Australia, as well as the guests from Europe that we have, and the others in the network who aren't here today in the room, but who will become active parts of it in the future, understanding what that funding landscape looks like and the extent to which it can be used to support applied research on this topic in post-industrial geographies from the perspective, this broad institutional perspective that we're using, would actually be really helpful. So those are kind of the pieces that we're looking for from you. And then what we're going to try to push out of this to keep this network going in the future. One would be events like this. So there are a couple of things coming up in the future, and there's kind of a rotational aspect that we're really looking for to have happen as we move forward. So the next event will be in the summer, and we'll send out information about this at the Regional Studies Association International Conference in Lugano, Switzerland. And so this is kind of another meeting that will happen now in Europe and maybe allow some more of the stakeholders from Europe and the people doing research there to come to that setting and maybe be able to travel more easily to that location. The Post-Industrial Resilience Network will be having a special session at the RSA conference there. And that would be a chance for a lot of us to get together again and see what this conversation looks like in a few months. So that will be at the beginning of June. Leonid had also informed me that there's an RSA conference being organized in St. Petersburg. So that would be specific then to the Russian context and maybe trying to get us to see what the value would be of interrogating that context in more rich way than maybe we've been able to do so far. So that will be in October. So that will be another few months down the road. What? 22nd and 23rd of October. So that's what we have planned in the immediate future for this year. I think it would be great if our guests from Australia, we've heard a lot about Melbourne, for example, if we could hold an event there as well and kind of rotate down to that setting. And part of the value of that rotation is that we'll all start to have a more intimate understanding of the places whose stories you've shared with us and the different folks, like who is a Joe or a Chris, down in Australia or in Europe, if they can be replicated at all. And also, what does the data you're gathering look like, and what are the communities you're from? So I think one of the good things to come out of this, would be actually having researchers from the U.S. go into different neighborhoods in Melbourne or in the Latrobe Valley, and thinking about what are these different concepts that the PR network is wrestling with? How can we actually be exposed to these places and gain sort of our own awareness of them, and maybe allow our perspectives to be broadened by that? So some of what we'll hope to get from you as well is in the future a willingness to host some future events, either collaboratively with others in the network or with other institutions that you work with that maybe aren't at the table here today. And the last thing is thinking about the scholarship that we produce. All right, so what are the outputs going to be? One of the goals of the network, obviously, is to advance theory and have it be an advance of theory that's really grounded in specific places and in the value of comparative case study. So one of the things that I'd like to see come out of this first meeting is a statement really of what the direction of the PIR network is going to be theoretically. And you'll see us start to work on that in the coming months. And then we're also planning to do an edited volume eventually that builds on what we're doing at the next few workshops. So we'll be actively contacting some of you for contributions to that effort. Chapters that dig more deeply into issues of ideology or issues of agency or empowerment. And I hope that you'll have an active voice in the structure of that scholarship going forward. So with that, thanks again to all of you for coming. I'll turn it over to Jim.
I would echo Tom's thanks. I really appreciate everyone coming and participating. The participation has been very good, which is really what we like. Speaking now on behalf of the Global Forum, not just this network, but the forum in general. As I mentioned earlier, I think we've been doing this now for about 6 or 7 years. Do you remember when the first one was? 2012. Yeah, so it's been about 5 or 6 years. The forum is dedicated to kind of doing these kinds of workshops. We've done them in Switzerland, Zurich, Lugano. We do them up here. We've done them down in Blacksburg. The purpose of them is basically to structure them around a particular theme of resilience that is not always addressed. So we've done one 3 years ago here, I think it was, on the normative dimensions of resilience. Last year we did one on resilience and fear and risk, looking at the interrelationships between those. We've done them on community resilience. In other words, we try to do 1 or 2 a year that kind of stretch the boundaries of the topic, to look at it from different perspectives. We've been fortunate at each one of those to have very good participation. A number of you are back from those conferences. And we anticipate doing similar kind of workshops in the future. So I would urge you keep in contact to kind of look at what we do. Some of them are more practitioner-oriented. We did one on smart cities and what that means, and what are the good and bad aspects of smart cities. As to outputs, you'll see a summary of this meeting. We'll get to you as soon as we can complete it. On a longer term, I will say, just as a point of encouragement, I guess, we've had at least, that I know of, 2 books coming out of the various workshops. One, both of them probably come out this year, one on challenges to transformative resilience, another one on the resilience machine, which came out of a workshop that we held here. So production of findings are important. A number of papers, joint authorships of people who've and perhaps most important, well, a third thing along those lines is the forum uses them to identify people who we bring into campus for 2, 3, 4 weeks as visiting scholars. So we've had Simon DeVuty, who you saw up here. We've had Julian Reed. We've had Jonathan Pugh. We've had Liesl Ritchie to come in and basically come in for 2 or 3 weeks, give a seminar or 2, and interact with our students and faculty. And out of that have come lots of interesting partnerships and ongoing production of scholarship. So that is why we hold these kinds of workshops. We purposely try to bring together people who may never talk to one another outside of this workshop. That is, bring people together who are from very different disciplines. The fun one was last year on fear, where we had neuroscientists, we had sociologists, we had geographers, we had political scientists, and what you soon learn is that they all think of resilience very differently. I'll never forget that meeting where our critical theorists were kind of downgrading the notion of resilience, and the neuroscientists were sitting over there with this puzzled look, and they're saying, we think resilience is a good thing. It's a good attribute. That's what we work for. So it stretches people's minds to think of things differently, and that's really what we're after. So, again, thank you so much for coming. Hope you travel safely and well getting back, and we will hope to see you again at another workshop that we'll be holding. And I see lunch is ready, so enjoy the lunch, have a good conversation, and again, as I say, travel well. Thank you.
Just push the button, probably. Yeah.